Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to part 5 season 3 of What If Deku Had Haki. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Rayleigh stood as still as a statue, forgetting to both blink and breathe. What Izuku just told him wasn't something he expected to hear, just as it was something he didn't want to hear. Two villains, both incredibly dangerous on their own, are potentially working together, and both of them can also use Haki. What should we do? Izuku asked, knocking the silver-haired geezer out of his state of shock. He then pinched the bridge of his nose, before thinking, this wasn't something he could simply ignore. The fact that Shigaraki had the Conqueror's spirit all this time is a terrifying thought. Even for him, the villain probably doesn't care about collateral damage. As such, he would ignore trying to contain its radius. But that isn't the only scary thing. There's also the fact that facing both Izuku and Rayleigh had probably made the villain stronger. The silver-haired geezer kept thinking, until he remembered what Izuku had told him about Night Eye. You told me that Night Eye was a Haki user, correct? Rayleigh asked. While still thinking, Izuku looked at his master quite nervously. As he answered, yes, with a little shaky voice, Rayleigh finished his thoughts upon hearing these words, before he told Izuku what he needed to do. I need to have a talk with Night Eye. I can't ignore this matter. Let me know next time you go to see him. I'll come with you, Rayleigh said, sounding more calm than he looked. Izuku only nodded at this response, before saying, until then we need to up everyone's training, especially mine. With a more determined voice, Rayleigh was surprised to hear this. He agreed that the others needed more training, but he never thought that his own student would say that willingly. The silver-haired geezer smiled, for he saw a golden opportunity ahead of him. All right, let's see if we can train Koda while we're at it. Also, there's a certain technique that I've been wanting to teach you, Rayleigh then said, wearing his usual trademarked smile. Izuku was intrigued after hearing this. He had been wanting to train Koda for a while now, but he really wanted to know what Rayleigh had in store for him. I use this technique against All for One. It's called flowing Haki, or Ryuo. It involves letting your armament Haki flow into your opponent's body, causing internal damage, the silver-haired geezer then said, wearing a confident smile. Izuku was a little shocked to hear all of this. He recognized that it was what Rayleigh had done to All for One, but what he told him to do was insanely difficult. He was more or less telling Izuku to manifest his armament Haki outside of his own body, without a medium. The green-haired boy gulped at the idea of how difficult this was going to be, but he was still determined to make it work. Rayleigh wore an even wider smile upon witnessing his student's reaction. He already knew that Izuku would manage to pull it off, but now he knew that it wouldn't be a problem. Class 1 was thrown into an even harsher training regiment than before, all thanks to both Rayleigh and Izuku. The master and student told both Mandalay about Haki, and managed to convince her to let Koda be trained by them. Izuku, meanwhile, was struggling with his own type of training. Rayleigh had already told him how Ryuo worked, but that didn't make it any less difficult. The green-haired boy couldn't pull it off, sometimes training for hours without any form of results, but he still kept going at it, refusing to give up. Training kept going, until the day finally came. Izuku received a message from Night Eye, telling him to come to the agency without his hero costume. The green-haired boy found this somewhat confusing, but he didn't question it too much. He quickly informed Rayleigh, before they both took off. Upon wandering, they both noticed that Kirishima, Uraraka and Asui were all heading in the same direction. Then they met the big three at the agency. Both Rayleigh and Izuku were confused by now, even more so when noticing all the heroes waiting inside. Rayleigh wore a skeptical look, not knowing what was going on. His intention was to just talk to Night Eye about their villain problem, but it would seem that he picked one of the most peculiar times to do so. The silver-haired geezer was about to say something, until he was interrupted when Night Eye called for everyone to enter a meeting room. The next few minutes were spent trying to get everybody seated, during which Rayleigh's presence was recognized. Everyone wondered why he was there, and that is when Night Eye spoke up. You're Mr. Rayleigh, correct? I don't remember inviting you, the hero said with his cold voice. Rayleigh looked at the man unamused, as he said, I invited myself. Besides, judging from what I've been told already, this matter could concern me directly. With a more serious tone, Night Eye barely flinched upon hearing this. He just looked skeptical while muttering, from what you've been told already, with an equally cold voice, as his gaze slowly made its way over to the green-haired boy that was next to Rayleigh. Izuku noticed Night Eye's gaze, as he looked towards him and said, no offense, sir, But I trust him more than you. Do you honestly expect me to trust a man that I just met, rather than the man that I've known for more than 10 years? With a calm voice, the entire room went silent upon hearing this. Izuku was the very definition of bold. His words were enough proof of that. Not only did he go against a direct order from Night Eye, he even had the guts to say that he wasn't trustworthy. Everyone turned their gaze over to Night Eye, waiting for his response. The hero fixed his glasses back into place before he spoke up. Expecting you to trust me more than your own master is nothing short of an insult to the both of you. I apologize, Night Eye said, sounding genuinely sorry. The entire room went still in shock. They had expected Night Eye to scold Izuku in some way, but instead he actually apologized. I have to say, I'm glad that you're here, Mr. Rayleigh. Your presence will make explaining much easier, Night Eye then said, sounding as calm as he usually did. Rayleigh looked at the hero confused, until he frowned upon realizing something. Why do I not like where you're going with this? The silver-haired geezer uttered, sounding tired as he did. Night Eye just ignored the old man's comment before getting on with the meeting. Night Eye and Bubble Girl went over the details and evidence that they had gathered so far, even talking about what Ryukyu and Fatgum had to add: quirk-erasing bullets, quirk-enhancing drugs, even the League of Villains. It was all brought up and connected to the Shy Hasekai, but when Eri was mentioned, it suddenly took a dark and disgusting turn. They couldn't say for certain, but it was the most likely scenario. Chisaki was turning Eri's body into bullets. Izuku clenched his fists in both anger and frustration. So did Tagata. She was right there in front of them. Izuku even knew how bad Chisaki was, but they didn't do anything. If only these two amateurs had gotten the girl away from him, it would have saved us a lot of trouble. Rocklock then scoffed, showing his annoyance. The blame is all on me. These two did not, Night Eye tried to say, but was cut off by the sound of wood breaking. Everyone looked to see that it was Izuku. Slamming his tight fist into the table, the green-haired boy locked his gaze onto Rocklock, staring angrily before a powerful wave was shot out from him. The entire room went dead silent, filling everyone's face with an expression of shock as this powerful aura engulfed them all. Rayleigh, Night Eye, Aizawa, and the students from Class 1 all knew what this was. Izuku was taking his anger out with Conqueror's Haki. The wave then disappeared, and sound returned to the world once more. Almost everyone in the room was shell-shocked. Regardless if they were pros or not, they didn't know what that was, but it shook their entire spirit. Midoriya, I believe that was uncalled for, Night Eye then said annoyingly, looking like he was less affected by the wave. Izuku was about to say something, but was beaten to it by Rayleigh. No, it was perfectly justified. This pro needs to learn how to shut the hell up. And I must commend Izuku for being able to show restraint. He could have easily knocked you all out just now, and you wouldn't be able to do a damn thing about it, the silver-haired geezer said, sounding like he was getting more and more annoyed by the second. The entire room went completely silent, all for different reasons. Those who didn't understand wondered what was happening, and how Izuku was so powerful. Those who did understand were shocked that neither Izuku nor Rayleigh were trying to hide what had just happened. Well, that is one way to introduce it. I was hoping to do it in a more formal fashion, but this will do just fine, Night Eye then said, acting like he was unaffected once again. Now there were mixed feelings in the room. Those who didn't know were confused. Those who did know were shocked. And both Rayleigh and Izuku frowned when realizing that the old man's comment from before had been for good reason. Everyone looked towards Night Eye as he spoke. What Midoriya just did is called Haki. It's a power that can be used without a quirk, and it allows the user to perform extraordinary feats. Anyone can learn to use Haki, but only a few like Midoriya and Rayleigh can bring out its full potential. Like we mentioned before, we have reasons to believe that the Shy Hasekai has teamed up with the League of Villains, but there's more to it. Thanks to the information that Midoriya was able to gather, we now believe that both Chisaki and Shigaraki are Haki users. The room fell silent once more. No one knew how to process this. All of this new information, it was hard to believe that it existed. But Izuku just proved that it was real. I was hoping that you all would be a little resilient to Haki, since you're pro heroes, but it turns out that I was wrong. Midoriya wasn't even using half of his full power just now, and none of you could stand up to it. There are only 3 people in this room that are equipped to deal with this situation, including me, Night Eye then said, almost sounding a little disappointed. The pros hung their heads in shame, recognizing the other two as Izuku and Rayleigh. The silence was then broken when Night Eye spoke again. We need more planning before we can go through with this. I trust that you give the other students Haki training during that time, the hero said, while looking towards Izuku and Rayleigh. The silver-haired geezer thought for a second before he answered, "Don't worry, I'll make sure to include the big three as well." With a calm voice, Night-Eye nodded at this. Before proceeding to wrap up the meeting, Izuku looked towards the other students in the room. Wearing a determined expression, it would be much more difficult from now on. And the others needed to be able to handle it. The students all looked back at him with determined expressions of their own. Especially Tagada. Training was suddenly cranked up to a whole new level of insanity. The students that were involved in the case were being pushed to their absolute limits. The students from Wana managed to improve their haki significantly. While the big three seemed to be struggling with it, Izuku struggled day in and out, trying to make Ryuo work. And his labors eventually bore fruit. It was hard to manifest. And it was almost random, but Izuku managed to use Ryu. He would need more training to use the technique more efficiently. But there wasn't any time for that. One night everyone woke up to a message from Night-Eye. The day had finally come. The students made haste, getting their hero costumes before heading out. They met up with Night-Eye and the other pros. Before quickly going over the plan, after that they made their way to the target. Everyone stood gathered outside of the Yakuza HQ, nervously waiting for what's about to go down. The UA students were all weary. But not Izuku. He and Rayleigh were standing passive-aggressively, staring at the gate without moving a single muscle. The green-haired boy was determined to rescue Eri this time. And he didn't care who came in the way. Rayleigh was right behind Izuku. And he intended to help his student no matter what happened. Everything was still for a moment, until both Rayleigh and Izuku could sense something big charging at the gate. "Get back!" the silver-haired geezer shouted while he and Izuku ran up ahead. No one had time to react to this exclamation before a hulking figure charged straight through the gate, knocking many officers away. Izuku and Rayleigh were quick on their feet, grabbing anyone they could and dragging them to safety. Meanwhile, Ryukyu, Hato, Uraraka and Isui were quick to knock and restrain the villain. The police then entered a close brawl with the Yakuza members that were swarming out, which in turn allowed for a group of Night-Eye, Rocklock, Fatgum, Izuku, Rayleigh, Aizawa, Tagada, Amajiki, Kirishima, Uraraka and Isui to run inside. They maneuvered their way through the building, eventually finding the hidden passage to the underground facility. They made haste down the stairs, hoping to quickly find Overhaul, but would be both shocked and angry upon reaching the end. Once they got to the very end of the staircase, the group realized that there was no hallway. There was just a massive wall. Izuku was about to shout in anger, but was stopped when Tagada spoke up. "Wait. I'll use my quirk to see what's behind it," the blonde said, before taking off his visor and walking up to the wall. He then went through the wall, before turning back and saying, "The hallway continues beyond this wall," with a somewhat calm voice. Everyone was slightly aggravated upon hearing this, realizing that Overhaul must have been placing a near infinite number of walls behind him in order to cover his own tracks. Tagada looked more annoyed than anyone else. They needed to get to Eri quickly, and they won't reach her if the entire group gets caught on the walls. He clenched his fist hard, before saying, "I'm going ahead. We don't have enough time," with a hint of determination, before slipping through the wall and taking off. Night-Eye wanted to shout and stop Tagada, but didn't when realizing that what he said was true. Overhaul was going to escape, so they didn't have enough time to sit around and wait. After Tagada was far away, Izuku ran up and threw a haki-infused punch at the wall. A massive hole was made in it, revealing the remainder of the hallway just like Tagada had told them. The group then continued on their way, but they barely got to take a single step before the walls began to twist and turn like they were made of liquid. The group began to lose their footing, leaning themselves against the ever-turning walls for balance. They all knew that one of Overhaul's men had the ability to take over and manipulate different objects, but they never imagined that he could do it at this scale. If they wanted to proceed, they needed to take him out. But to do that, they needed to find him first. Izuku's levels of frustration rose dramatically. He couldn't find this person. He seemed to slip away from within the walls over and over again. "Damn it, where are you?" the green-haired boy shouted in frustration, on the verge of just using Conqueror's haki and be done with it. "Calm down, Izuku. You won't get anywhere if your mind is clouded," Rayleigh shouted, sensing the conflict within his student. Izuku looked at his master and realized that he was right. He wasn't thinking straight. And it wasn't the first time either. Almost every time he's ended up in a bad situation, he let his anger and emotions get the better of him. But he wouldn't let that happen this time. The green-haired boy took a deep breath and closed his eyes, letting his mind fall into a deep tranquility. He shut out everything in the outside world, letting his observation Haki slowly analyze the area. The person he was looking for was within one of the walls. As such, he needed to both find him and use an attack that could actually reach him. After just a few seconds, he could feel the presence of his target, and he knew exactly what to do. Izuku opened his eyes and took action immediately. He leaped to one of the walls, the exact place that his target was, and readied his fist. A normal punch wouldn't be enough to reach him. But what Izuku planned on doing was far from a normal punch. He reeled his fist back, coating it with Haki, before throwing it at the wall. It made no more than a dent upon colliding, but that quickly changed. The wall suddenly broke apart, shooting out an unconscious man as it did. Everyone looked at the scene in shock. As the hallway stopped twisting, it wasn't just that Izuku had managed to find the man. It was the way that he took him out. The wall didn't break in a normal fashion. It shattered from the inside out. Rayleigh grinned upon witnessing this, for it was a huge step forward. What Izuku did wasn't just a normal Haki-infused punch. He had managed to use Ryu at will. The old man walked up to his student, patting him on the back, while saying, "Well done, took you long enough to get there." With a grin, Izuku grinned back at his master, while panting lightly. "I hate to ruin the moment, but we should keep moving forward," Night-Eye then said, interrupting Izuku and Rayleigh's moment. The two quickly got back to their senses before taking off with the rest of the group. Tagada didn't stop for anything. He just kept going. He knew that Eri was up ahead. He didn't need to use his pathetic excuse for observation Haki to know that she was here and she was in need of saving. That is why he refused to stop. He even went as far as to channel 10% of One for All, the most that he could manage right now, just so that he would get there faster. The blonde eventually caught up with Overhaul and attempted to surprise attack him, but it was to no avail. The villain sensed his entry and immediately created a stone structure to block off the attack. Tagada staggered backwards when this happened, gritting his teeth as he did. Overhaul sensed his attack coming, which meant that he had a well-trained observation Haki on top of the armament Haki that Izuku had already informed them of. The blonde didn't know what to do. He barely knew anything about Haki, and he was about to engage an opponent who clearly knew what he was doing. Tagada continued to grit his teeth until his gaze landed on Eri. She was scared. If Tagada didn't do anything right now, she would have to suffer through more pain, and he couldn't let that happen. The blonde steeled himself, deciding that he would have to defeat Overhaul regardless of the circumstances. Overhaul looked unamused, staring Tagada down with cold and dead eyes as he slowly removed his gloves. The blonde saw this as his opportunity, as he charged the villain with One for All over his entire body. Overhaul wasn't even fazed by this. He just created stone spikes to fend off the blonde hero. Tagada gritted his teeth once more as he permeated through the spikes in an attempt to reach Overhaul again. The villain would see this coming, however, and would once again block with a stone structure. This exchange continued repeatedly, achieving the same result over and over again. Tagada would try to charge Overhaul, only to be stopped in some way. Eventually, the blonde hero grew tired and slowed down, which led to him taking severe damage. Tagada didn't know what to do, for nothing seemed to be working. He just couldn't hope to match Overhaul when he was using observation Haki, and he couldn't reach the girl that was standing behind the villain. The blonde hero felt the despair wash over him. As his vision got blurry, the world was now unclear to him, but he could faintly make out what was happening. He was barely able to keep his balance, while the monster that was Overhaul dug his cold glare into him. A faint point of what looked to be a massive stone spike then came charging at him, but Tagada couldn't muster up the strength to avoid it. He just stood there on trembling legs, struggling to keep himself up. What felt like an eternity passed as the blonde stood there. The spike was inching closer and closer by the second, but he wouldn't be able to avoid it. It would pierce his body, and that would be it. He waited until he thought that he could feel it, but that's when it stopped. The sound of stone breaking filled his ears. As Tagada's vision came back to him, the spike had been shattered by something, but it wasn't by him. Two figures stood in front of him, the figures of a familiar old man and student. "Did you leave to party without us, Blondie?" the old man said, as he turned his gaze towards the blonde. Tagada smiled gently upon hearing this, for help had now arrived. Rayleigh's smile never left his face as he saw Tagada. The blonde had been able to hold his own against a dangerous opponent. That was commendable. The silver-haired geezer watched as Night-Eye carried Tagada away. Before turning back to Overhaul, the villain wore a cold expression, barely reacting to the group that had entered the room. He just stood there, unamused. Behind him was none other than Eri, And she looked terrified. Rayleigh only needed a quick glance to determine his course of action. As he said, "I assume that you're Chisaki. I've heard a lot about you. And all the trouble that you've been causing. You're strong, I'll give you that. But not even you can handle this many people on your own," with an intimidating voice, as he raised a Haki-infused fist, as if responding to Rayleigh's declaration. Izuku also raised his fist. Then Uraraka, Kirishima, Asui, and Night-Eye all followed in a similar fashion, for what seemed to be the first time in forever. Overhaul was surprised. He wasn't impressed with any of the heroes. He could feel what was within them. He could tell that they were all Haki users. But his surprise wouldn't last long. He could tell how little experience most of them had, out of all of them. Only the silver-haired man, the green-haired boy, and Night-Eye were any form of threat. If that wasn't enough, the old man had made a horrible mistake with his statement. "I must commend you for your power. But I can tell that all but 3 are novices. Also, you're mistaken, old man, who said that I was alone," the mask-wearing villain then said, sounding just as cold as ever. Both Rayleigh and Izuku were confused by Overhaul's statement. Until they realized something, they didn't get to think any further upon it. However, before being interrupted by something incredibly dangerous approaching them at rapid speeds, "Jump!" Izuku shouted in a panic, before leaping towards the ceiling. Everyone did as Izuku instructed, and jumped. "Uraraka!" Izuku then shouted, which in turn prompted the brown-haired girl to make everyone levitate. Just seconds after jumping, everyone could see how the ground below them began to crumble and decay. The level of destruction left everyone horrified. Until they turned to the source of it, Izuku's eyes widened with anger. As he saw the familiar pale and hand-covered figure standing, the figure stared back at Izuku, before wearing a sadistic smile and saying, "Long time no see." Midoriya, with its sadistic voice. Everyone either frowned or cowered at the sight of Shigaraki. Izuku was right. He was working with Overhaul. Not only that, but he's been training. That's not a normal decay. It's spreading to things that he isn't touching, Night-Eye said, perfectly explaining what just happened. Rayleigh frowned upon hearing this. As he said, he's combining his decay with Haki and letting it spread into the ground. With a hint of anger in his voice, everyone was either horrified or angered after hearing this. Realizing just how dangerous he had become, Izuku was about to say something, but stopped himself when sensing something else approaching. "Uraraka, release!" the green-haired boy shouted in a panic, which in turn prompted Uraraka to do as he said. Everyone landed on the ground. Just before multiple Haki-infused spikes shot out of the ceiling above them, everyone was gripped by even more horror, realizing that those spikes would have pierced them if Izuku hadn't seen it coming. Izuku, Rayleigh, and Night-Eye glared at both Overhaul and Shigaraki, realizing how bad the situation was. They were the only ones who had any hope of standing up to these villains. But that wasn't the only worrying part. What was more worrying was that both villains could attack the other group members. Orrery, at any time, they were basically held hostage. Their only hope would be to fight them both at the same time, while the others would try to get Ori to safety. Izuku could feel how his scarred arm was aching for revenge on Shigaraki. As he spoke up, "I'll handle Shigaraki. Can I leave Overhaul to the two of you?" the green-haired boy said, sounding dead serious. Both Rayleigh and Night-Eye looked surprised at first, but they quickly shook it off before nodding in confirmation. Izuku then turned to the others and simply said, "Save Ori, and don't die," before turning his fierce expression to the heartless demon that was Tamura Shigaraki. Outro. Thank you all for indulging yourselves in the story thus far. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. Firstly, we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes deep into the facts and lore of a wide variety of anime. It's sure to expand your weeb knowledge for all kinds of series guaranteed. On top of that, we have a third channel called We The Celestials Naruto What Ifs. It's what we do on this channel already, but in the vast world and lore of Naruto. Go check it out if you're in the mood for some jutsu action. Secondly, on behalf of We The Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. Lastly, if you're interested in what we do here at We The Celestials, then I would like to extend out an invitation to join the team. The only caveat being we only accept members 16 years and up to join our crew. You can sign up for whichever category fulfills your interests by joining the recruitment Discord using the link in the description below. Our Discord is an all-around fantastic place to be. Whether you're a fan or looking to join our band of misfits, we're always looking for members to join us. Well, that's it from us for today's video. So, thank you all for watching. and have a great day.